Hello, my name is Connor Quinlan, and in this review I'm going to be reviewing the Nikon 10-24mm DX zoom lens. Now what I'm going to be talking about in this review of this lens is my first thoughts, what I think of it straight from the box, build quality and control and stuff like that. Then I'm also going to talk about the image quality of the lens and show some sample pictures for that. Then I'm going to talk about how this lens performs in the field and what this lens is primarily used for. Now the first thing I want to talk about is the look and feel of the lens. Now the first thing I thought of when I took it out of the box was that it actually feels really plasticky. It's true, this lens does feel not as well made as I had hoped it would feel. The zoom ring is kind of sticks sometimes, and it's got, the external movement like that, which is more characteristic in cheaper lenses. And the older 12-24mm lens had the internal movement and didn't have this external thing, which is, in the build quality of the 12-24 was just so much better. This is just not nearly as well made. And the zoom rings just they feel kind of cheap and stuff. Other than that, build quality is okay. I'm sure that the inside of this has metal components that are pretty tough, but on the outside, pretty plasticky. And as for the zoom, it's also finicky, cheap, kind of plasticky, not really up to the standards of how much this lens costs. Another thing that I don't actually particularly like about this lens is how small the manual focus ring is. Now, using this in the field for a while and after getting used to this lens and using it for the day, I had real trouble trying to grab this lens without, looking up and taking a look to make sure I was grabbing it. It just takes a little while to find, and it's kind of a pain. The only real nice thing that I really like about the lens is how nice and large the zoom ring is, and that it's nice and far from the camera, so it's easy to grab the entire lens and zoom in and zoom out and stuff like that. So all in all, the lens feels pretty solid. It doesn't, shake around or feel like it's loose or anything like that. It feels solid, but it definitely zooms and looks a little bit cheaply made. Another thing that's a little disappointing about this lens is that it doesn't have a constant aperture like the old 12-24mm. The 12-24mm had a constant aperture of 4. This one has a variable aperture of 3.5 to 4.5 at the longer end. And that's another characteristic of cheaper lenses that Nikon has decided to use on this pretty substantially expensive lens, which is really too bad. A lens like this really should have a constant f-stop if they're going to charge you so much money for it. So, sadly, this lens has less pro features than its predecessor. The only pro feature that I can really tell that this lens has is this little rubber seal here that keeps dust from getting inside the camera when you put it on. All in all, I'm not saying that it's a really crappy build. I'm just saying it could have been a lot better. And similar lenses like the previous Nikon and even Tokina lenses are better built than this. Now I'm going to put this lens on a Nikon camera body to give you an idea and to give you some scale of the lens. Now, this camera is a Nikon Pro camera, so it's the largest camera Nikon has. So it's a lot larger than many other Nikons, but you can still get an idea of the size and the look of the lens. This lens overall is actually pretty small, very nice and compact, which is a really good thing, really light compared to other ones in its class, and easy to carry around, fits in a bag very nice and easily. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you over to my computer. We're going to look at some sample images that I took with this lens, and we're going to look at things like image quality, distortion, vignetting, and stuff like that. Here we are at the computer and looking at our first sample image. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the sharpness of the image first, and this is at 10mm at the largest f-stop of 3.5. And we're going to look at center sharpness first, this Saguaro here. Now, at the very largest aperture, the sharpness in the center is very good, which is to be expected of this lens because it's pretty pricey. As we stop down to f-stop 5.6, we see a little bit of an increase in the sharpness. Not necessarily in the swirl, but in these twigs here, in the very fine details of the tree. And then when we go to f-stop 8, we can see a little bit more sharpness added to that center. But at 5.6 is pretty much the optimum center sharpness that you get, and it's pretty sharp. Now we're going to look at the corners of the frame, or the sides of the image, and as you can see at f-stop 4, it's pretty soft in the sides of the image, especially on this right side over here. You can see that the trees here don't have much detail. You can't really see any twigs of the tree. But when we stop down to 5.6, you can see a dramatic increase in sharpness. Once again, 3.5, 5.6, you can see a lot more details in these twigs. And then at 8, you can see a ton more detail once again, and 8 is the optimum aperture for sharpness. And we can look over here too. We are at f-stop 3.5. f-stop 5.6, there's a huge increase in sharpness. It's very, very sharp in the sides at f-stop 5.6. And in f-stop 8, it increases once again a little bit more, and you have your optimum f-stop. Overall, at 10mm, at the optimum f-stop, you've got a very overall sharp image. It actually does perform better than the 12-24mm lens, to my surprise. And of course, it is the best performer in its class. The only lens that really comes close to it are the Tokina 12-24 and Tokina 11-16mm lenses, which I also have reviews of, and you can check out. The next thing we're going to look at is 24mm end, the longer end. I'm going to start with center sharpness again. As you can see, it's very sharp even when wide open at f-stop 4.5. Stop down to 5.6, it's pretty much the same. It doesn't really increase in sharpness that much. And at f-stop 8, it is once again slightly sharper, but center sharpness is pretty much the same throughout all the range of f-stops. Now we're going to look here in the corners. Starting at f-stop 4.5, and 5.6 is a little bit sharper, and then at 8 it's pretty much the same sharpness in the corners. And we can look over here, the more detailed twigs. You can see it's a little bit soft in the corners and the edges at f-stop 4.5 at the largest f-stop, but when we stop down to 5.6, you can see a small improvement in the sharpness. And at 8, we can see a pretty dramatic improvement in sharpness. So once again, the optimum f-stop is f-stop 8, and your entire image by f-stop 8 will be in pretty sharp focus. Next thing we're going to talk about is the flare on this lens. And flare, I'm surprised to say, is very well controlled with this lens, better than I really expected. Here we have the sun right in the corner of the frame. The only real flare that we can see is this little area right here, which is a few dots. So if you're shooting into the sun, it's not necessarily something that you have to worry about. As long as the sun's not in the picture, you're probably not going to get any flare. And then here it is at 24mm, which is barely noticeable. There's some flare up here and a little bit of light flare down here. It is not as good of a performer at 24mm than it is at 10, which is actually pretty surprising. So once again, you just want to keep the sun out of the corner of your frame so that you don't get any of that flare in your images. Next thing I'm going to talk about here is distortion. And here we have a straight line horizon. You can see some pretty visible barrel distortion, although it's not terribly visible. It's not as visible as I thought it would be. The 12-24mm I think actually had a little bit more noticeable distortion. And once again, this distortion is pretty easy to correct in Photoshop, although I don't think you can correct it fully. And then at 24mm we do have a little bit of pin cushioning, but once again, not really all that noticeable. And those are the focal lengths that you see the most distortion. And even then, for this lens, I'm surprised it doesn't have that much distortion. It really, really doesn't, which is really nice. Last thing we're going to look at is vignetting. I'm going to go back to our original images, and you can see that at this largest f-stop, 3.5 at 10mm, there's quite a bit of vignetting, and you can see that circle around the frame here. But as we stop down, you can see that it goes down a little bit by 5.6, but it's still there. It's still noticeably there. But by 8, it's pretty much completely gone. Once again, here we are at f-stop 3.5. We're going to zoom in on the corners. You can see the vignetting up here. 5.6, a lot of it goes away. then by 8 it's completely gone pretty much. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about before talking about how this lens performs in the field, I'm going to do a little example of the focusing speed. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to its minimum focusing distance and zoom all the way out to infinity and see how long that takes. As you can hear, it's actually very, very quick. Once again, very fast, very quiet, best in its class basically. Now the last thing I'm going to talk about now is how this lens performs in the field. And as you can imagine, it performs very well. This lens is primarily used for, of course, landscape photography. And the sharpness, the flare control, all the image quality things about this lens are pretty good, best in its class. There's no other lens that can compete with the Nikon. The only lenses that come close are the Tokina lenses, which are pretty substantially close and can perform almost just as well for a lot less money. And those Tokina lenses are a lot better built than this lens. And like I said, that's the real only disappointing part of this lens is the build quality. It's just built like a cheaper lens with a variable aperture and the external zooming. So the build quality is definitely not worth the price, but if you want the absolute best image quality, this is the lens that you want to get. Although you do have to be careful with this lens in the outdoors because it can probably get dust inside of it. And I would not trust being able to bang this. Would probably get banged up pretty easily and could probably break as well. So you got to be careful with that. If you want the best bang for your buck, I would go for a Tokina 12-24mm lens, which performs nearly just as well as this lens and is much more rugged for landscape photography. But once again, that decision is up to you. And this has been a review of the Nikon 10-24mm lens.